I'm John Hofle, and with me in the studio today are two members of our basement team, Peter Martinson and Sky Shields, and Lyndon LaRouche.
Therefore, the question is, are we going to be slaves? Are we going to be slaughtered? What's the method? Well, the program is, you have a British agent called President Obama. President Obama is being used to launch a general war which is aimed at Asia. This is a very interesting point. Why Asia? Well, let's look at population. And also look at something else. The transatlantic region of the world is collapsing economically, physically and economically. But Asia is not collapsing at that rate. China is upward in motion in many respects. India has been greatly strengthened in some respects, similarly. Russia is come back. Now, Russia is an integral part, naturally, for all kinds of historic reasons, a part of the... Russia is a Eurasian nation, not a European nation. And it's moving more toward the Asian side now, just after revival of the Siberian region, together with China and India and Japan and Korea and so forth. So there's a stability, relative stability, and progress in that region, the Asian region, the Eurasian region, while there is a collapse, a terrific collapse in the transatlantic region. It's a catastrophe. So therefore, you have, how do you reduce the population? You have a world war whose primary aim is to take out the Asian part. How do you do that? Well, you had to take a Middle East war. The Turkish government has been changed. It was no longer the Ataturk tradition. The Ataturk tradition is there, but the Ataturk tradition was removed. So now Turkey is doing something which Turkey was never supposed to do under Ataturk. Remember, it was Ataturk who negotiated a peace treaty immediately with where? In the Middle East. This one. Right? So therefore, now they're going to reverse that in order to get the war, which will be intended to be a nuclear war, turned loose in the Asian region, the Asian Pacific region. Because the transatlantic region is already dying. The United States is dying. It was killed by Bushes and things like that. South America, dying generally, except for Argentina. Africa is totally a British colony, a period of mass death imposed by the British Empire. There is no other empire in Africa. There's only the British Empire, and that's the mass killers. So therefore, they've got the rest of the planet taken care of in terms of population control. And as long as the United States is sucker, we too, we're gone. Under this president, we're gone, unless we throw this thing out. So that's the reality. In other words, it's not a systemic, gradual process. It's a willful process in which people who understand that they represent the oligarchical principle are out again to take the animals, called us, and reduce the population of animals, otherwise called peasants, things like that. Reduce us to levels that the empire will tolerate, that the oligarchy will tolerate. Is all entirely unnatural. For example, in the history of the animal kingdom, which some of the people in the basement have been working on for some time, over the 500 million years of formal forms of life, the direction of forms of life on this planet for the past 500 million years has been in an accelerating rise to higher forms of life, and an evolution of the planet itself, which has been shaped by the evolution of forms of life, from lower unicellular creatures and more and up and up and up, into the mammal species, which is more stable animal species, and then out of the animal species they come an emergent dominant human species. And so this is the nature of things. What the oligarchical principle does is goes in a different direction, the downward direction, artificially, to cut down population, to make people backwards, to deny technology, to demand that people be made ignorant, this sort of thing. A highly artificial system. This is not inevitable. There is no second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics is a lie. The entire history of life as we've known it on this planet for about 500 million years has been a consistently upward tendency. And the only way that animal forms of life have continued to exist, and plant life as well, is existed by evolving to a higher form of energy flux density. So the idea of controlling population, restricting population, preventing things that make population grow, is entirely an artificial oligarchical principle. It is a principle of pure evil. So we're up against, not against some natural process, not against that we have to fight against. We're against an anti-normal process of mass destruction, of civilization, of the condition of the human species. And what that means, that if were the British to succeed, what you would see as a consequence, at this point, you would see an extinction of the human species and the degeneration of the planet. So, for moral and other reasons, the British can no longer be tolerated. They can be tolerated as going back to be apprentice human beings.
We can re-recruit them, maybe.
Re-recruit them and try to get them to become human at last. But so this is not a natural process in any respect. The natural processes on this planet, in this galaxy as far as we know, goes in a completely different direction. So the British are an unnatural species. And some of their sexual and other behavior typifies that. But that's the case. So once we understand that, we understand that we represent defenders of the human species and defenders of the planet against oligarchism. And that's what the struggle is about. That's what the fight's about. These guys are the enemy. The British Empire is the enemy of mankind. It's the enemy of civilization. It's the memory of the intention of this planet for as long as we have knowledge of it. And it's highly artificial. And therefore we, when asserting certain things, progress, when we insist on progress, on scientific progress, on technological progress, we represent humanity. We represent the authority, not them. And we have to take the authority away from them because it doesn't belong to them. It's not merely a matter of taming these bastards. It's a matter that this thing can no longer be tolerated. This is a disease from which humanity must be freed.
Now, it's typified by what you're seeing with the destruction of the space program and the dismantling of these frontier projects. But what you're actually doing is the attack is being launched on a much more fundamental level, but on an invisible level. It's a more ontologically significant level than the effects that you're seeing economically. And we discussed yesterday, it was in a phrase that you used in your second to last paper, in your Obama's Armageddon Endgame, where you, a sentence a lot of us had fun with, you made the point that life and cognition are of the same ontological character as metaphor. Mm-hmm. Now, somebody could misread that easily because what they're missing, I think what's difficult for most people to understand is that metaphor has an ontological character. Mm-hmm. And you've been driving that home in recent papers, recent discussions, that there is, meaning that this is not something, metaphor is not something that we use to talk about real things. Metaphor is the substance, and the things that you think are real are not the actual real things. And the understanding of a human economy, a human economic process depends on that recognition, that there's a primacy of metaphor. This gets you to the actual substance of what the universe is composed of. Everything else you see is a shadow of it, that you call space, that you call time, that you call matter. That's a shadow. What drives the process, what lets human activity tap into it and steer this thing in an anti-entropic direction, is this primacy of metaphor. And I think that's an important point to drive home.
Well, actually, I've been on this metaphor case since the immediate following of World War II. This is a period in which I was driven into classical forms of poetry, which is something which I neglected at a later point after about 1950. I had other things on my mind. I never gave this up, though. But I always understood metaphor, and I think people like, for example, the work of Shelley, you see the same thing in other poets who are classical poets. But Shelley was the one I dealt with first. I also began to dealing with some of the relationship between the leader and poetry in the German as well, which I got fascinated with. But you recognize from this that what we think we know pertains to sense perception. That's the pretension. And therefore, we use words in two different ways. And the meaning of prose has degenerated into the meaning of degeneration. Prose has become degenerate. You take speech literally. You take the words of speech literally, as if they were the physical reality. In poetry, you don't. If you use poetry for literal meanings, so-called, then you're stupid. You don't understand poetry. You become a typical popular thinker today. You like popular opinion, popular entertainment. The kind of music that most people like today destroys their minds, destroys their morals and minds. Why? Because it is not natural. And the poetry, which is based on this principle of metaphor, it happens to be the truth. It happens to be scientifically true. You take one case, for example, the discovery of gravitation by Johannes Kepler. Now that's a process that starts with earlier, but his discovery of gravitation was on the basis that sense perception does not determine truth. That's the significance of Kepler's discovery of gravitation, that sense perception does not determine truth. And you look at his discovery of that, you see that. It's exactly there. Mm-hmm. All competent physical science is based on the principle of metaphor to find a principle of nature which does not correspond to sense perception. And you realize that sense perception means something, but it's not the truth. So therefore you realize you have to go to ironical structures, which we call metaphor. And the key of metaphor, as Shakespeare makes clear, or others make clear, it never tells you literally, it never presents a literal truth in words. Never. What it does, it takes concepts of words and it says, what do these sensations mean that I'm responding to? And you say, well, there is no direct meaning in the simple thing of word. Deductive method applied to language is not truth. It's a blur. And so in poetry, what the mind does, and in classical music and in poetry, as opposed to the other varieties of things, it's a juxtaposition of two things which have no direct connection to reality, but only an indirect. Because what we are responding to is sense perception. Now, sense perception is not truth. Sense perception is you have senses which are part of your organism, and they are juxtaposed. When you try to get a deductive relationship between different sense perceptions or different sense experiences, you are not in the truth, you're in the world of fantasy. You don't know what truth is. In real science, as in the case of the discovery of gravitation by Kepler, as a perfect classical case of this, you do not try to find a deductive relationship between sensations. You say, this is not the truth. Mm-hmm. This is what my senses are telling me. But that's not the truth. The truth involves principles which are independent of these kinds of sense perceptual experiences. Right. And this is done for us chiefly with great classical art. Literalist art is not classical. Deductive art is not art. Deductive connections are not truthful in science, because what you do, you're left with irony, And we come now to, we abandon space. The first thing to come discover truth in science is get rid of the idea of space. There is no such thing as space. So when people call it physical space-time, they're not in the domain of truth. They're in the domain of fantasy. And what we progress to as we progress, as the great progress in science has always been, and the great progress in art has always been, classical art, has always been to recognize that what we call literal meaning is not truth. It's the ironical juxtaposition of contradictions within the domain of that experience, which is truth. It's in that domain that the idea of principles exist, and there is an identity between the principle of poetic or musical poetic kinds of irony and the way the mind works. When you get rid of the idea of space, as actually Einstein did, for example, and others did, when you eliminate the idea of space as existing, as an ontologically existing thing, you suddenly have entered into truth. You suddenly, for the first time perhaps, have gotten an insight into what physical science is. There is no space in physical science. We know, for example, the universe is dense, richly dense beyond all imagination. In terms of all space would be space, it's all filled up. There's no room for space. It's all this radiation. It's there. So therefore we become stupid by believing in popular entertainment rather than classical entertainment. We become stupid because we believe in something that does not exist. And we become dependent upon instructions given to us on which way to turn, who to sleep with, all these kinds of complicated ideas. Right? So that we are not truthful people because we have rejected the ability to know truth, which is demonstrated by classical science, by classical artistic composition, the great works of irony which inspire us and move us. And it's this power of creativity which is contrary to what you call popular opinion. Popular opinion is the death of the human soul. It's the classical artistic conception, which is the same thing as the classical scientific conception, which defines the freedom of mankind, the quality of mankind, where mankind's own judgment leads mankind to truthful effects. For example, people who believe that it's the greenies, for example. The greenies are people who have a disease. The disease is an anti-human disease, where they become denatured. They lose all characteristics of humanity because they're denatured. Because they do not believe in reality. They believe in sense perception. And you cannot get truth out of sense perception. Like, take the President of the United States, for example. No truth there whatsoever.
Actually,
No,
literally, you can't. I mean,
literally, yeah.